memorabilia. Okay, this is Jerry Amernick, author of the new book Babe Ruth, A Superstar's Legacy, which is now available on Amazon and at the website baberuthlegacy.com. We're back with the Babe Ruth Legacy interview series, and my guest today is Joe Orlando, who's a pretty big player in the sports collecting and sports memorabilia industry. And believe it or not, that is a billion-dollar industry. And before Joe says anything, I just want to read a short quote from the book that Joe gave to me. And this is what he said. If somebody said to me, Joe, we'll give you $1 million and you must spend it in the collectibles world, I can't think of a more stable investment than Babe Ruth. All you have to do is check with the auction houses over the last 3 decades. Babe Ruth set the standard, and it'll never be eclipsed. He has set the standard in every single category of memorabilia. Well, Joe, welcome to the Babe Ruth Legacy series.
Thanks for having me on, Jerry.
So, let's elaborate on that quote. Why do you say that? Why would he be the one that you would invest the money in?
Well, you know, Babe Ruth, what's so interesting about Babe Ruth compared to a lot of other legends of baseball and other sports is that his standard remains today. When people refer to a new upcoming prospect, we know, of course, that Ohtani, who has come locally here where I'm at in Southern California, out to the Angels, what do they refer to him as? He's the Japan's Babe Ruth.
Right.
So even till this day, he is the standard for excellence in sports and outside of sports, but inside the hobby,
right,
he's the name. When you're talking about autographs, you're talking about game-used equipment, jerseys, bats, you're talking about baseball cards. He's the guy that everybody wants. He's the foundation of the collection.
Okay, so Joe, let's talk a little bit about you and your company. Your company is Professional Sports Authenticator, PSA, which is considered the leading player in third-party authentication and grading services for high-value collectibles. So tell us a little bit about that, what it is exactly that you do, and how you got involved in it.
So I'll try to keep this as short as I can. So in the 1980s, when the hobby really started to boom and became a nationwide phenomenon, the issue was if I walked into a store, let's say you owned a baseball card shop, and I walked into your store and I was interested in purchasing something, there was an inherent conflict of interest in the sale. Because the person, in this case it would be you, the person selling the item was telling the buyer whether or not it was real, and then B, what the value of, or the grade of it was. So right. Third-party authentication came into being for, at least in regard to PSA, in 1991. So we've been in business now for, this will be our 27th year. And it really helped level the playing field. Now there is a third party who has no financial interest in the sale of the item, rendering an independent opinion, and that's why it's so important. And today, and I know this would shock most people how big this business is, but today we authenticate and grade on average somewhere between 150 to 175,000, maybe even 200,000 items per month.
Well, and as I understand, you've authenticated some 30 million items since you got going. Is that right?
Yes, and to give you some perspective, so between 1991 and 1998, PSA graded about 1 million total items. And then from 1998 to present, we have authenticated and graded over 1 million items each and every year. So it took several years for the concept to really take hold, but now it is a critical part of the overall industry. So
for the layman, if we can just explain it simply, you're basically the organization that makes sure that whatever the item is legitimate. Is that correct?
That's right. So people send us items, whether they're baseball cards, autographs, game-used bats, and we render a third-party opinion. So we're sort of the judge and jury of the authentication world.
Okay. Now, are there other companies that do that as well? Are effectively competitors to you, or are you the only one, or are you the biggest?
There are a handful of companies at one time. If you go back about 15 to 20 years ago, there were actually dozens of fly-by-nights that came into the industry. But today there are a handful of competitors in each independent field, but we are the largest.
Okay. And every year there's an annual show, the National Sports Collectors Convention, correct?
That is correct. Yeah, that's the big showcase for our industry. And while the certainly our industry has changed quite a bit, just like the world has changed over the past 20 years with the internet. There's still it's still a great attraction to be able to go out to the show and meet everyone in person, all of the auction houses and dealers that people deal with over the web, each and every day.
Yeah, I understand. And I think it's August. This show this year it's going to be in Cleveland, and I was looking at some of the previous shows. I mean, they get enormous numbers of people at these things. It's incredible how big it is.
Yeah, some of those people come in to meet and obtain autographs from some of the celebrities that they bring to the show, and others are there to interact, like I said, in person with other collectors that they've met over the internet or dealers and auction houses that they do business with. So it's a great time. If you're into sports collectibles, it's a great time to be out at the show.
Okay. So in terms of dollars, how big is the industry today?
As you mentioned earlier in the interview, the saying goes that it is a billion-dollar industry. I can tell you this. Over the years, it has changed what makes up that billion-dollar figure. At one time, there were several baseball card manufacturers just within the one sport of baseball. Today, Topps is the only company that has a license to produce baseball cards. So at the manufacturer level, it has changed quite a bit, but the high-end area of the market has escalated in an incredible way over the past 20 years. So if you and I had a time machine, we don't have to go back to the 1950s to find a pack of 1952 Topps baseball cards to get rich. If we could just go back 10 years ago, 15, 20 years ago, the difference in the price levels for high-end sports collectibles then compared to today, it's enormous in some.
And people that are involved in this business, I'm sure there are many who are well-to-do, but I'm sure there are also many who aren't necessarily well-to-do. Is that right?
That's right. The wonderful thing about this industry is that there's something for everyone and something of every level of disposable income. So if you're a collector, if you have that gene and I have it, we joke, amongst ourselves as collectors, whether or not we're infected with the collecting disease. I certainly have it, but if you have it, there's something for everybody.
Okay, I'm holding the book, Babe Ruth, the Superstar's Legacy, in my hand. As the writer, of course, it's dear to my heart, but I should mention to our listeners that you, Joe, were instrumental in helping us get the photograph that we used on the cover of the book, which was a photo of Babe Ruth taken in 1920 in the first year with the Yankees. He was in the dugout, and it was a large, single-framed photograph that a collector named Scott Ireland bought at an auction. I believe it was 2004, and he kindly gave us permission to use the photo, and he was very gracious in doing that. And as I understand that photograph, a single framed photo that was later signed by Babe Ruth, sold at the auction for about $150,000. And I never saw this photo until really a few months ago after you sent it to me, and I was immediately struck by this photograph of this young, powerful Ruth holding the bat.
Yeah, in my humble opinion, Scott's image of Babe Ruth is the best single photo of Babe Ruth that exists because of not just the size of the photo. It's an enormous photo, but the image of Ruth is almost haunting.
Yes, it is.
It's incredible how it strikes you. But I do have an interesting story that I may not have shared with you before, but I'd like to share it with you now. So in 1999, the largest single collector auction, at least up until that time, was the Barry Halper sale at Sotheby's.
Right.
And in that auction, there was a lot that looked almost identical to a layman to this photo. It turned out that it was a painting. It was a painting of this photo, including the autograph. A painter actually tried to replicate the photo that Scott owns.
Right.
And it sold for $35,000 at that time. And then several years later, Scott purchased the real McCoy at a Sotheby's auction for the $150,000+ that you mentioned. But Scott's a wonderful guy, and he has a tremendous collection. But this image of Ruth is just striking.
Well, when I saw it, I felt exactly the same way. And I've seen so much stuff about Babe Ruth over the years, but I had never seen this photo. And he looks like a young, powerful, almost a little bit mean. A guy that could certainly hit 700 home runs for sure. It's not the Babe Ruth that we see depicted in some of those movies.
Than Babe Ruth, right?
Well, Cobb didn't hit 700 home runs, but okay. So
that's right. No, that's absolutely right.
So let's get back to Ruth. Why is he so big? You said to me at one time, you said there are two categories in the business. There's Babe Ruth, then there is everyone else. And other people have said the same thing. Why is that the case?
You know, I'm starting to smile because when I think of Babe Ruth, I think of some sort of fairy tale, mythical character, and that's what it is. It's that kind of character brought to life. And if you look at his, from his rags to riches story, and just everything about him, his persona. I mean, it's amazing. Look at his autograph. If you just looked at his autograph, that it almost tells you about the man himself. It's very bold. It's very confident. It's it's beautiful looking. Like
very neat. Yeah, it was very neat. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, everything about him. Again, he seems more like a mythical figure than a real person. And I think because of all of those things, just his gregarious nature to his home run hitting him and the way he changed the game, the way he dominated the game. I mean, and by the way, no matter how good a player is today, I can't imagine fully appreciating looking at what Ruth did in his prime. I mean, that would be like a home run hitter today out-homering teams and hitting, 250, 300
No, exactly. And he did that routinely out-homering teams.
Yeah, I mean, it's so hard to fully appreciate for those of us, obviously, who did not see him play and how far ahead of his time he was. I think that's what it is. I mean, he is the total package when you think about his personal story, what he did on the field, and his sort of everlasting legacy. That's why people they clamor for Ruth items.
We have an image in the book of a contract that he signed in 1918. So he would have been with the Boston Red Sox then. And the actual contract, sold at auction for over $1 million in 2014. Now, somebody would say, how is that possible that a piece of paper sold for over $1 million? Why?
Why? That's a good question. Again, it goes back to what he means to... I guess I'd put it this way. If you think about the American dream, if you were to pick one poster child for what that is, like someone to represent the American dream, it's Babe Ruth. I mean, he's the guy that comes to mind for me. Of course, I'm a sports guy, I'm a baseball guy, but I think it's about what he represents to so many people. That is why those collectibles sell for what they sell for. It's not just what he did on the field, it's what he represents to people.
Right, and of course there's the jersey that sold at auction back in 2012. Jersey from 1920-21 with the Yankees. It sold for $4.4 million, which is a Guinness World Record for an item of sports memorabilia, and that was Ruth's jersey.
Yeah, no, I mean, and if you go down the line, Ruth's jersey, the bats, the contracts, I mean, he tends to set records in virtually every single category. And what's very interesting is that people often assume that a particular item is rare. Now, in the case of the jersey, it is very rare. But with Ruth, the demand is so strong that even though he did, for example, sign quite a bit, the value of his signed items holds up, especially single-signed baseballs, even though he signed a ton of them, because there is such overwhelming demand for his signature. Well,
one of the items is the bat he used to hit the first home run in the first game at the original Yankee Stadium, which I believe was 1923. It had sold for something like $1.3 million at an auction. The thing that's interesting, that total is about half the cost of building Yankee Stadium in 1923, which was like $2.5 million, which is mind-boggling.
It is, and it's funny, you mentioned that item. People ask me a lot, I've been here now for about almost 20 years, and PSA has been around for 27 years. And people ask me quite a bit, what is your favorite item that has come through the doors?
Right.
That is my favorite item, and because that day, I mean, this is again, it goes back to Babe Ruth being who he was. You can't make this stuff up. So on opening day, who does he beat? He beats the Red Sox with a 3-run home run. It's the first home run hit in New Yankee Stadium. Of course, Babe Ruth is the one who hits it.
Right.
I mean, it's something that can't be. It's not a record that can be broken. No one else can hit the first home run in Yankee Stadium history, and that's what he did that day. I mean, you can't make it up.
Well, Mike Gibbons, the guy who really has run the Babe Ruth Museum in Baltimore for almost 40 years, he said to me once, he said that he was in the right place at the right time all the time, which I'd never heard before, but I think there's some truth to that. Now, one of the fellas that does a lot of work with you, Kevin Keating, who's a real autograph expert, he told me something that I found remarkable. He said during Ruth's peak from 1920 to his death in 1948, Kevin Keating said Babe Ruth signed 2 million autographs. And I said, how is that possible? He said, well, it works out to about 196 a day. And even that sounds crazy. And then he went on to explain, no, it's not crazy because he was in such demand. And he feels that about 1 million of those 2 million autographs are still out there somewhere, and they're worth a lot of money.
You know what? I'm certainly not going to debate Kevin Keating on this because none of us were around at the time. But the bottom line is, no matter how many autographs Babe Ruth signed, it was an enormous number. As a matter of fact, and I'm sure you've done this, when you go back through and you look at a lot of vintage images and you see Babe Ruth in these enormous crowds. Sometimes it's children, sometimes it's adults, sometimes it's actually signing for the military.
Right.
I would not question that number. I think that it's probably accurate because a guy today, like a signer today, a celebrity or an athlete, I mean, they can sign hundreds and hundreds of autographs just in a few hours. So Babe Ruth, he loved to be out there with the public. It would not surprise me.
But they signed for money at these shows, and this is what I find interesting. At one of the conventions a few years ago, I think they had Willie Mays there, and he was signing autographs for, I don't know, $300-400 a crack. And I was thinking, if Babe Ruth was alive and appeared at one of these shows, I mean, his autograph, it could be $1,000 to sign an autograph, but I'm thinking Babe Ruth would tell them, forget it, I'm never going to sign for money. He just signed for anybody and never charged.
Well, obviously we're in a different era in terms of, how, athletes are perceived and looked at, but all you have to do is just look at all those photographs, look at the video footage. He loved people. He loved to be out with the people.
Absolutely.
And so many athletes, I mean, and certainly it's a different era today, but so many athletes want the exact opposite. They don't want to be out in the people, with the people. So Babe, that was something that made him unique, and why, again, another reason why I think even people, today love him so much is because of that part of his personality.
Now, Joe, I understand with autographs, and his autograph is obviously in the most demand, more demand than anyone. I understand there's still a pretty high rejection rate, a figure of about 50% of Babe Ruth autographs that supposedly are Babe Ruth autographs, but the rejection rate is something like 50%, which means they're deemed not to be authentic.
Yes, but let me put it into context. What's scary about that number, what I remind people about is, look, PSA has been around now for almost 3 decades. So people know not to send PSA obvious forgeries because they're going to waste their money, right? It's not going to pass. So if our rejection rate is in the vicinity of 50% or more, just imagine what the percent of fraudulent Babe Ruth autographs is out on the open market, ones that have not been presented for certification. So that's what we see, but the percentage out in the marketplace is actually much higher than that.
Okay. And Joe, for the future of the business, my understanding is that it's really been growing by leaps and bounds in the last number of years, and I gather it's going to continue to do so.
Yeah, the industry, like I said, it's changing. So with kids today, and this is a concern, long term, with kids today, they have so many distractions with technology that, look, there aren't as many young people into baseball card collecting as there once were, even, 20, 30 years ago, let alone, 50 to 80 years ago. But at the high end of the market, and this is where Babe Ruth comes into play.
Right.
Vintage items, even on modern items, if they're considered rare, high-end, historically significant, that part of the market is growing substantially. And again, all you have to do is look at the published auction prices realized, and you can see the consistent escalation over the last 3, 5, 10, 20 years on that type of material.
What if I asked you, what are some of the more oddball or strange things that Babe Ruth may have signed over the years, or Babe Ruth items? Anything that comes to mind that's a little, off the beaten path?
Oh, geez, a little bit of everything. We've seen hats, and when I say hats, I don't mean baseball caps, but just random hats, different types of hats that have come in. Gosh, we've seen just about anything you could imagine. I'm trying to think of something that he hasn't signed, but there's so many different mediums. Of course, people gravitate towards the traditional things. Like there's nothing more symbolic of autograph collecting than a single signed ball. And of course, who's the one that's in the most demand? Babe Ruth. But as far as oddball items, you see so many different things. But we see a lot of different pieces of clothing. Again, all different types of paper products. But it's almost endless.
So if we go back to how we started this interview, Joe, if you've got a Babe Ruth item that you got at an auction or wherever, it would be wise to hang on to it for some time?
Hey, I know people have different approaches to, I guess, retirement, 401ks, and so forth. I mean, to me, collecting something of high quality, that's related to Babe Ruth. I mean, I think that's as good as gold. Right.
Okay. Well, on that note, we're going to finish for today. And Joe Orlando, I want to thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Jerry. Appreciate the time.
You take care.